Are we living in the Matrix or the real world? One question that has fascinated people for decades is whether we're living in reality or merely experiencing a convincing illusion of reality. Most people know this idea from movies. The Matrix, virtual worlds, computer simulations, artificial intelligence, digital consciousness. But what's interesting is that long before Hollywood explored these ideas, philosophers were asking remarkably similar questions. How do we know what's real? Not what feels real, not what appears real. What is actually real? Think about it. Everything you know about the world arrives through your senses. You see, you hear, you touch, you taste, you smell. Your entire understanding of reality is filtered through biological equipment that has limitations. You don't see ultraviolet light. You don't hear every frequency. You don't perceive every detail around you. Your brain edits, simplifies, filters, and interprets information constantly. In other words, you're not experiencing reality directly. You're experiencing your brain's interpretation of reality. And that raises an uncomfortable question. If our perception is filtered, edited, and interpreted, how certain can we be that we're seeing the world exactly as it is? Now, before anyone panics, I'm not suggesting we're trapped inside a computer simulation. I'm simply pointing out that certainty is more difficult than most people realize. In fact, there are countless examples of our minds constructing realities that don't actually exist. Have you ever misheard someone? You were absolutely convinced they said one thing. Then you discovered they said something completely different. For a brief moment, your reality was wrong. Have you ever dreamed something so vividly that you woke up confused? For a few seconds, the dream felt just as real as waking life. Have you ever become convinced someone disliked you only to discover they were dealing with their own problems and barely thinking about you at all? Again, your reality wasn't reality. It was an interpretation. And perhaps that's what fascinates me most. Not the possibility that we're living in a simulation, but the possibility that every human being is already living inside a simulation of sorts, a simulation created by their own mind. Think about two people attending the exact same event. One person describes it as inspiring. The other describes it as exhausting. One person remembers kindness. The other remembers disrespect. One person sees opportunity. The other sees obstacles. The event was the same. The realities were different. Why? Because human beings don't merely observe reality. They interpret it constantly, relentlessly, automatically, which means much of what we call reality may actually be, here's my favorite word, perspective. The older I get, the more I notice that people don't argue about facts nearly as often as they argue about interpretations. Two people can witness the same conversation and leave with entirely different conclusions. Two people can grow up in the same household and tell completely different stories about their childhood. Two people can work at the same company and describe two completely different cultures. It's almost as if every person carries around a private version of reality, not because they're dishonest, not because they're irrational, but because human beings are meaning-making machines. We don't simply experience events. We assign significance to them. We tell stories about them. We connect them to previous experiences. We build identities around them. And eventually, those interpretations become so familiar that they feel indistinguishable from reality itself. That's why I've started wondering if the real question isn't whether we're living in the Matrix. Perhaps the real question is whether we're living in reality at all, or merely inside our perceptions of reality. Because if we're honest, most of our stress comes from stories. Stories about the future. Stories about other people's opinions. Stories about what might happen. Stories about what should have happened. Stories about who we are. Stories about who we're becoming. We spend enormous amounts of time reacting to realities that exist primarily inside our minds, and occasionally those stories do prove correct, but often they don't. Which means many people are suffering inside simulations of their own creation, not computer-generated simulations, psychological simulations, narratives, assumptions, expectations, interpretations, entire worlds constructed from thought. So, are we living in the Matrix? I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. But I do know this. Every single day, millions of people wake up and spend their lives reacting to stories they've told themselves about reality. And if that's true, then perhaps the most important question isn't whether the world around us is real. Perhaps the most important question is whether the version of reality inside our own minds is.